Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Arlie, and we're going to talk about her book, The Outsourced Self. Intimate Life in Market Times, and you're going to define what outsourced is.
Outsourcing is when you're paying someone to do something that, let's say 30 years ago, you didn't pay somebody to do. If, for example, a young person was looking for a partner 30 years ago, there would be church socials, there would be after-school meetups, there would be family or friend dinners where you might meet somebody. Today, it's more likely that someone would put down some money and join Match.com. In fact, for a in the first chapter of The Outsourced Self, I described the story of a 49-year-old woman who was divorced, had a 12-year-old, and was lonely. And 30 years ago, she wouldn't have outsourced this task of finding someone, but she said, look, you know what, time is getting on, and I'm going to bite the bullet and do this. And so the story gets to the heart of the matter in The Outsourced Self, because it's of a very nice love coach and a very efficient service and a very nice person using it. So we're not talking about any issue with the people involved. But what happens is that in the course of doing this, she's introduced to a way of thinking about herself and a way of thinking about others that is market-like, and she is called to draw a line between herself and that market way of thinking. So this is a perfect storm. There are new needs, new social class out there that has these needs, new social anxiety about those needs, and there's an elimination of alternatives to the market. We don't live with public services. There's a great denigration of anything the government does. So we don't get to live as much of Europe does, with paid parental leave, for example, with shorter hours of work, with great public preschool and schooling. So we can't turn to the public sector, and we can't turn to the old-time community either. So the alternatives to the market are disappearing, and the market is growing. And there's one third factor that makes this a perfect storm. We're living over the last 3 decades in a political climate that heroizes the market, denigrates anything else. And we've seen the privatization of prisons, of schools, now of parks and libraries. So there's a kind of a move to put much of the public realm, civic realm, into the market. And this looks to me like one step more. Well, let's put private life into the for-profit sector
But
too.
it seems like there's a
perfect storm.
Yeah, there's a confluence of factors. One of them, as you said, is the loss of the village life, the community, the neighborhood. And so people have real needs that aren't being met. Need for community, of sharing, of someone to help them deal with the different questions that they have in their life.
Yes.
And that seems a real loss.
Yes. I just learned about a new service called Social Susan, which helps you find friends online for a price if you're, say, new to an area. And at first I thought, well, terrific. This is a new way of finding friends, of getting the community we lack. Then I began to think twice, because on the one hand, if you walk down the street, everyone's on their cell phone and not looking at you. If you stop to sit in a park, everyone's on their cell phone and not looking at you. If you go to a restaurant, everyone's on the cell phone and not looking at you. So it's really hard to make friends if you're looking to make friends, because even that very first act of looking you in the eye or saying hello or nice day has disappeared. So there's a kind of almost a unconscious, no one person's responsible for it, disappearance of that first act of making friends from the public realm. So that's a kind of a takeaway. And then there's a kind of a give back. Now you can pay for a service that through the internet will get you a local friend. But there's a new language in that service. It said, an efficient way to find a friend. Good ROI in finding a friend. And then it also says that you want to be put in the company with people who are really committed to finding a friend. And what's the emblem of commitment? That they've paid. That means they really want a friend, is because they've paid. Then they must be motivated to find a friend. Well, is that the sign we want of commitment in a desire to find a friend? I think it's more a social class filter. And finally, they say it's very good to sign up to our service, because if you want to sell something and you're looking to market a product, well, what better way to find friends? So you would be put in the company of people that are trying to sell you something. And maybe just sell to each other. Who knows who joins this thing? It's all new. And in a way, that's what the outsourced self is doing. It's looking at what can become a big trend. It hasn't hit everybody. I mean, Facebook, for example, it's 11% of the world's population are on Facebook. And that's not everyone, but hey, a short 10 years ago, nobody was on it. So I'm just trying to give in this book a heads up where I think the social trends are aligned such that they're pointing us in this direction. And you could say, well, this only hits the affluent, and you'd be right mainly. Although poor people eat out, for example, as often as rich people do, but they eat out at different, cheaper places. But this is just as important for poor people as it is for rich, because if we're all moving into an everything for sale world, and if market culture comes with many of these for sale services, poor people are doubly out. For the outsourced self, I did a survey of California residents, and I compared rich to poor, and I discovered two things. One is that poor people want these services more than rich people do.
I thought that was very...
What a paradox, that the people that can't afford it are the ones that want it the most, and the ones who can afford it want it less. And the reason for that is that poor people have less community, helpful community, than rich people do. I asked one question: do you agree or disagree with this statement, that you can't always count on family and friends, but you can always count on money to get what you want or get what you need? And poor people were far more likely to answer yes, that's true, than were rich people. So if we're moving into an everything for sale world, public services, and now even private life outside of the market, you're really hitting poor people doubly. You're taking their social citizenship away from them because they can't fall back on community, helpful community, in the way that middle-class people can.
There was another thing that really was disturbing about the invisible people. And this process has a way of making people invisible.
Yes.
And that's just really troubling. That in full of our arrogance of, I want that, I want that, I want that, and it's all about me, and not thinking about the impact on the other people that you're learning it from.
Yes.
And it doesn't, to you, apparently that doesn't matter. It's what you want, and if you have the money to buy it, there's no question about that.
And there's a general ideology that, hey, this is something we're choosing, and if you have mutually beneficial transactions in the marketplace, why not? And for much of life, we need the market, and the market is great. The whole point here is to focus the reader on the balance between the market and everything else. We're used to looking for balance in the government between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. But what we're not looking at is the balance between the market and everything else. And that balance is altering our emotional life. And that's why I think this is important, that we're having to develop new rules of engagement, and that those new rules of engagement are, in a way, indicate that we're trying to regulate capitalism from the inside, because it's not regulating itself, and it's leaving, as you're emphasizing, a whole stratum of people out of the whole story. So I guess that also, I learn from stories, and in the outsourced self, I
really
tell a lot of them.
thing.
It's how, yeah, they're almost just so stories. I learn from people, and give you one example of what gets not noticed and how we get taken over in a way by a for-profit world. I interviewed a man who said he worked very long hours, he traveled a third of the time. He had 3 wonderful daughters, and the youngest of whom was coming up for a birthday. And he looked left and right, and his daughter's friends all had parents who hired birthday party planners. And he thought, oh, this is absurd, this is silly, this is going too far. He drew the line, going too far. You don't outsource the preparation of a birthday party to somebody else. That's something a good father does. So he started himself to plan the party. He sent out the invitations, he blew up the balloons, he put pinned the tail on the donkey up on one wall. In came 8 little 5-year-old girls, and the party began. Things were going fine. But he had the idea that there should be an entertainer, an idea he got from the fact that there were services in the neighborhood that had entertainers. So he thought, well, I will dress up as Crocodile Dundee. So he got a great big 10-gallon hat and boots, and he began stalking up and down in front of an array of 5-year-old girls. And he began talking about wrangling crocodiles and how you do that, and then he moved to kangaroos and to koala bears, and then he ran out of things to say. And all these restless little 5-year-olds began to wiggle, and then, because they were used to being organized by a planner, they fell apart into chaos. And so all the parents who were ringing around the room had to put down their glass of white wine and sort of get into action and make people create order out of chaos. And then a neighbor came up to this father and said, Michael, get real. The experts know how to plan these birthday parties better than you. Experts know what 5-year-olds think is funny. So now that piece of information, what your 5-year-old thinks is funny, her ticklebone, is now in the hands of an expert to know. And you, the father, you just have to dial in and get an expert that knows what your kid will laugh at. That became the idea. And he had said, no, I don't need an expert. After the neighbor gave him this humiliating evaluation, he changed his mind. Yes, the expert knows better than I do. I really don't know what makes my daughter laugh or her friends, so I give up. So he redrew his line and let the market do it, And it wasn't until much later that I interviewed the daughter, and the daughter said, oh, thinking back on that, first we were embarrassed, and then we thought it was hilarious, and now I think what a dad I had, that he jumped into it, and I'm so lucky to have a dad like that. So what are we learning from a story like that? We're learning that that the expert and the neighbor thought that the meaning of this whole event was in the outcome, was in the purchase point, was in the final result. Did they laugh? Was there an aha moment? And then put all the meaning there. But over time, what we're realizing is that all the effort he put into it, the invitations, the balloons, the effort, became for the daughter an emblem of his concern, of his emotional attachment to the event. And I guess I think that whether we buy a service or not, we're increasingly living in a world that has a market-like way of assigning meanings and telling us where to look for joy, and that taking it away from the process and putting it on the result, taking it away from the journey and putting it on the destination. And I think it's time, and in the outsourced self, that's what I'm trying to do, is say, wait a minute, we're more influenced by an everything for sale world than we may realize we are.
Well, one of the themes throughout is the issue of memories.
Yes, yes.
What does create memories?
Yes. You're referring to a service that is called Family 360, which is a service that used to be, that it is still used in companies to evaluate executives. And they go into an office and they interview the executives, co-workers, boss, subordinates, give them a 360 review, and then give him feedback how to improve. Now that service comes home and evaluates that executive as a father. And around the dining room table will sit children, his wife, a nanny, a sister if she lives nearby, brother, and each sits down with a stubby little pencil and paper and gets given a set of objects, behaviors, they call them, of the father, and they rank them, one of which is memory creation. On a 1 to 7 scale, how does Dad do in creating family memory? And in a way, for me, this is poignant. I mean, here you take a man that's trying to be a good father, but he's bowing down to the authority of the company, its methods, its tools to tell him how well he's doing at home, as if you need that. Anyway, he was trying to create family memory. A lot of philosophic premises behind that. There's an image of control that you can force a kid to remember something and forget other things. It's quite a... yes, that's right. But as I went through my interviews, which were of service providers, providing services at each stage of life, and clients who were hiring people for help at each stage of life, in those interviews, I asked them, what are your memories? What stands out as an important, meaningful memory for you? And almost without exception, these were of times that were unscripted, when something unforetold happened, an accident occurred, where spontaneous feeling was expressed, and where people were giving things. People were walking the extra mile. The most affluent person I interviewed for the outsourced self was a woman who actually hired a personal assistant to not only purchase Christmas gifts for her family, but to write out the tags, from Santa, to Timothy and so on. So she outsourced a great deal of her personal life to paid assistants. But when I asked her for an outstanding memory, It was the time she spent all night in the emergency room with a friend of hers. The friend's daughter had become unconscious in the swimming pool, and they were not sure the girl would make it. And this woman was most proud of herself. That was the outstanding memory. That was where she said, "That's who I am." Not a time she got the perfect result, but the time she gave. So people would...
I thought
those were the
of
memories.
your book in the larger sense of memories, because you have all these narratives, and you're interacting with all these people, and then you're reconstructing, you're weaving all this together in your own narrative. And one of the questions I had is, what was the impact of, I mean, you're dealing with some pretty intense elements of, intimate life. What was the impact on you of listening to all of this?
I was immensely moved, and I learned a lot. This was a journey for me, and I came to feel really a liking for everyone I met, and an understanding of the different needs that bring people to the market, and the different enormous skills that service providers offer. But I felt I was talking to very good people in a very bad system. That's what I came to feel, and that's the impact it had on me. Bad system, why? Well, many of the service providers wished that they lived in a different world. For example, one birthday party planner said, "I love doing my work. It's a cheerful work. People are happy. But I'd give my right arm to be doing this work in children's cancer wards. Then I would really feel rewarded. But who would get paid for that? Who would pay me to do that?" Another woman, an elder care worker, said, "The world really needs what I do. I really reach out to isolated elderly people who are disabled, but often their families live at a distance. I make a really big difference, but who would pay me to do this for the poor?" And they all agreed that if there were services for all the people who needed these services, there'd be plenty of jobs to go around. But they didn't live in a world that put those jobs there, that paid them for those jobs. So, yeah.
We must talk about the ontologist,
Yeah.
which is bizarre and sad at the same time.
Exactly my reaction. Actually, I've just been on email with the ontologist, and she's an extraordinary person. She was a trained psychologist and had a 20-plus career as a PhD psychologist, clinical psychologist. And ontology is really a method laminated onto basic psychology. And at first, when I realized this was her specialty and I knocked on her door in San Jose, California, I thought I had come to the end of the world. What can't we outsource? It's one thing to outsource proposal planning or wedding planning or potty training, but to outsource the task of figuring out what you want, that seemed to me, there's nothing more you could outsource. But, and here's an example of how I changed. As she explained it to me, it made a certain kind of sad and curious sense. I asked her, give me an example of how you would interact with your client. And she said there was a woman who lived in a medium-sized house that had a medium-sized garden, and what she really wanted was a large house with a large garden. And so the ontologist said, well, how do you imagine you would feel if you got what you wanted? And the woman said, peaceful. And she said, okay, tell me of an experience that made you feel peaceful. And the woman said, well, when I walk along the water's edge in the ocean, I feel peaceful. And then the wontologist, in her Socratic method, said, well, the ocean is 2 hours away. Is there a place closer by that gives you that feeling of peace? Well, yes, there is. In a park, there's a stream, and when I walk by that stream, I feel peaceful. And step by step, it led to the solution of the woman dedicating a room of her middle-sized house to ferns and greenery and the sound of running water. And so I thought to myself, what's going on here? In a way, we live in a highly commodified world. We pay to buy these things, and then we're paying for a service to get us not to want those things that advertising has asked us to want, and that while the wontologist and her client were both nice people, I again felt we have to look at the entire system of wanting and to ask ourselves, is this the society we want?
I kept thinking this is a post-empire kind of process where we have the arrogance of having luxurious resources. We're used to that, we expect it, and we can't live with it.
Yes.
And so we're trying to find some way, as the decline happens, the empire no longer exists, to still live in this protected, wonderful world. And it's just not there.
That's right.
And we don't know how to, we've lost all the connection from the community that we existed in, and now we've shunned that. We said, no, that's the old way. We need to live in the modern way, the contemporary way, the postmodern way, whatever. We can't live in it.
And how wonderful is that world? If we're talking about equality, do we want the equality where poor people are now hiring proposal planners too? Or do we want to live in a world that is community rich and that is civic rich, and in a community where there is a balance, a restored balance between community life and state provisions and the market?
Well, thank you for being on.
Well, thank you.